I was 3 years into tenure track at the time, and probably I wasn't as thoughtful about it as I should have been. I had a general sense that, well, no, I shouldn't be taking on any time-consuming new hobbies, and blogging felt like a time-consuming new hobby, uh, and that there was then something indecorous about the time-consuming new hobby being out in public where people could see it.
This is the Lawyers, Guns, and Money podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Lawyers, Guns, and Money podcast. My name is Rob Farley, and joining me today are fellow front pagers Scott Lemieux and Dan Nixon. Say hi, guys.
Hello. Since we're talking about old school blogosphere, I want to note that I'm drinking a delicious cold frosty Coke Zero. Since I'm not one of these sickos who's going to pretend that the competing beverages are remotely comparable quality. So just wanted to throw that out there to get us in the right spirit.
Well, in the interest of sobriety, I have here my cherry Coke Zero right here. So I think we're all pretty close.
I also have a cherry Coke Zero.
Well, I'll have to go up and get a glass of Pepsi Zero or One or whatever, Max or whatever it's called these days, which I'm drinking now apparently because that's what the formula for the Soda Stream is. So.
Oh my goodness! So the reference, if people haven't seen it, was a recent Wall Street Journal article which was talking about the eclipse of Diet Coke by Coke Zero, which frankly is something that should have happened a really long time ago, and it's unintelligible to me. Now, but we're getting ahead of ourselves, right?
Yes. Sorry, I don't mean to preempt.
It's this. I mean, the discipline for this show is locked down tight as a drum, right?
Yeah, you're going to find as tight as a drum, Jason.
There's not an ounce of spare fat on this body.
The level of preparation, no all killer, no filler. Yeah,
this is like a Pac-12 running back of a podcast. Yeah. So this is also the re-inauguration of our series, which is an oral history of the blogosphere. And joining us today, you may have recognized his voice, but you probably didn't, is Dr. Jacob Levy. So Dr. Levy. Levy, I'm sorry. Dr. Jacob Levy, who is a newcomer to our podcast, but is certainly all over the old blogosphere. So Jacob, welcome to the Lawyers, Guns, and Money podcast.
Thank you, gentlemen. Good to talk with you.
Good to talk to you again. Glad you could join us.
So I guess I will throw out the first question here, or the first observation, and just invite you, Jacob, to sort of take us back the decades, right, where you began to become involved in this thing that came to be known as the blogosphere, right, the old blogosphere. So tell us a little bit about your journey for those of our listeners and also ourselves who may have forgotten how we ended up in this place.
All right. In the interest of it feeling like an oral history, I resisted the temptation to go review archives and nail dates down. I'm going to instead do my best to just kind of talk through how it looks in my memory. I believe that it was within a couple days of each other, Dan Dresner and I, 3 office doors down from each other, in Chicago political science, independently decided to start doing this in the fall of 2022. And that was a boom time for the idea of academics starting to do this. One of the first things that I did on my sidebar when I launched a blog was to set up not just a general blog roll, as we called it in those days, but a blog roll specifically of scholar bloggers, of academics who were engaged in this funny kind of online chatter. My first post was a reflection on what I took to be promising and appealing about this as a thing for academics to do, distinguishing it a bit from other kinds of public intellectual engagement that I thought were less susceptible to feedback, less oriented toward citations via hyperlinks, and less able to have something like serious critical engagement back and forth. These were, I, I still think, hallmarks of what the golden age of blogging looked like that, of course, fell off pretty rapidly. After a couple of years of blogging on my own, I added one thing and then switched one thing. The addition was that Dan and I got commissioned by the New Republic to start writing, each of us separately, monthly columns for the New Republic Online at a time when a magazine's website was a very different beast from the print magazine. So we were not New Republic columnists, we're New Republic Online columnists. But that became a high profile outcome of the blog as it existed then. And then sometime in the same time frame, I joined the Volok Conspiracy, the group blog of, then we would pretty robustly have said libertarian. Now we would say, at best, conservatarian leaning to conservative, but of mostly legal academics. But I joined as an in-house libertarian-ish political theorist. Carried that through until 2005. So really only about 3 years altogether before I drifted off for a variety of reasons that maybe will come up in conversation. But insofar as I was part of the history of the emergence of blogging, that's the time frame that we're talking about. About 3 years combined at my individual blog and then at the Volok blog.
That 3 years, though, I mean, it sort of felt like an eternity when people were living it, right? And I say this almost on the eve of our 22nd anniversary, and we even started after you. But perhaps it's because of where people were in terms of their careers, and perhaps it's because of where we were politically, which seemed very fraught in 2002 to 2005. Although later events have suggested perhaps not as fraught as we thought. One of the questions I always ask for these, and then I'll pass it on to Scott or Dan. Do you remember sort of what platform you used? Because that's a question that used to matter way back in the day, right? Whether you go on Blogger or WordPress or TypePad or whatever.
I used Blogger.
Blogger, oh, cool.
It was just a Blogspot blog.
Yeah.
That was for my individual. I don't remember what we were on for the Volok Conspiracy at the time.
Jake, were you ever part of the Crooked Timber masthead? I'm forgetting.
I was not.
Okay. So that all runs together. I forget because some people were temporarily part of that and some were, because that's another major, yeah.
I think there was never any overlap between the Crooked Timber group and the Volok group. There were people from both who ended up on a subsequent 2007, 2008-ish New Republic group academic blog called Open University.
That's I remember right. That.
Yeah, that's the that. Right. That's what I thought there was that.
And I ended up on that.
Right. And there was also some antagonism over the less libertarian, more conservative parts of Volok and Crooked Timber, obviously, but would not have primarily involved you.
Yeah, that's right. I've always been very friendly with the Crooked Timber folks, and in the end, friendlier with them than with some of my co-bloggers at Volok. But it was a clear enough cluster differentiation between the social democratish, more political theory and political philosophy group at Crooked Timber and the more libertarian-ish law and legal theory. And I was kind of there as an adjunct legal theory person over at Volok.
Yeah. Ironically, I've been either unfollowed or blocked by Henry or Daniel. I'm not like premature anti-Greenwallism. I'm not sure exactly why, but anyway. But Rob still has good relations with Henry, so so I know that's A story for another day. So I'm interested, obviously, and I feel that I can revisit this to some degree since you ended up with what I would consider to be a 99.9th percentile academic job. But obviously, you and Dan Dresner were both at Chicago at the time, and obviously, you're now at McGill, he's now at Tufts. And so, obviously, one of the things that we had to think about as academics blogging at the time was, would this be a good thing or a bad thing? So this is the time when the Ivan Tribble or whatever that the pseudonym was wrote this thing, but very proudly talking about how he's on an admissions committee. And he found out that like somebody like Star Trek, like, well, obviously we can't consider them for an academic position. It's like, like you're providing good advice. Do you really want to be putting this in public? Like, but anyway. But,
no, I believe there was even a line that he included, right? It's like, well, even if what they've written so far isn't bad, think about what they could write in the future on their blog. Okay.
Right. They could write an academic, he didn't seem to understand that there were no barriers to entry for like a blog spot. How do you know anybody's not going to start off a blog where they talk about academic meetings? Like, this is dumb. Anyways, it was so dumb. But, obviously, that was obviously an easy argument to dismiss. But, there are really legitimate considerations in terms of there might be certain advantages, but there could also be, attracting visibility can be a problem to the tenure process, especially, one at a school like Chicago. So how much did you, I just sort of made the decision basically that I wasn't going to be pseudonymous, that if I couldn't say what I wanted to say and pursue an academic career, it wasn't worth it, which maybe I just got lucky. But, how did you, did that weigh into it at all? Was that something that you were considering about, the sort of strengths and weaknesses that this would have, as you were going to go through this tenure process?
I was 3 years into tenure track at the time, and probably I wasn't as thoughtful about it as I should have been. I had a general sense that, well, no, I shouldn't be taking on any time-consuming new hobbies.
Right.
And blogging felt like a time-consuming new hobby. And that there was then something indecorous about the time-consuming new hobby being out in public where people could see it.
Right.
Because at Chicago, that meant you were spending hours a day that were not very conspicuously, show-offingly working 18 hours a day.
Right.
Which is not just a fact about the tenure track at Chicago. That was, at least at the time, a fact about the general academic culture of Chicago, genuinely from undergraduates to the most senior of professors. You weren't entirely supposed to admit that you ever did anything except for working. Mm. I didn't think much about the question of whether the things I was saying were going to be unpopular or disliked by my senior colleagues. Probably I didn't think about that enough, but at the end of the day, the reasons why I had differences with my senior colleagues did not arise out of the fact that I was saying them on a free website. They arose out of the underlying fact that I had genuine differences. When I first got my job at Chicago, this is a story I've told in public before, so it's not so much out of school, but I won't name names. When I first got my job at Chicago, I had one senior colleague just openly say to me, be careful, watch your back, it's a snake pit. And another senior colleague who, after a long metaphor about fences and neighbors, good fences make good neighbors at Chicago, people don't believe in any intellectual fences, and therefore eventually they get really sick of each other. He said, every decade or so, this department explodes. And people get caught in the crossfire because every decade or so, this department just explodes. And in the meantime, it's incredibly intellectually enriching, but every decade or so, the department explodes. So the department exploded. There was some Chronicle of Higher Education speculation, some speculation on other blogs at the time about whether Dan and I got denied tenure in ways that were really causally related to our blogging. And I thought then, and I think now, that's not really the right way to think about it. There were underlying differences between us and our senior colleagues at a time when the department had one of its periodic explosions.
Yeah, and I do remember you saying that at the time that the lesson would be that you did not believe that blogging per se was a decisive reason in you not getting tenure, because that was obviously something I was paying attention to because I was a little later on in the
Yeah, it didn't do me any good,
right,
but
yeah,
and it's funny 25 years later to think about just how little good it had the possibility of doing anyone.
right.
From a vantage point where now publishers just demand that the authors of academic books be present on social media, do their own book promotion, manage their own ability to get book reviews out. I'm now starting to encounter presses that are telling the authors need to themselves arrange book reviewers,
Wow.
which looks just transparently corrupt to me.
Yeah, no, that's bad in a lot of ways.
But that you should be public and networked is now so thoroughly a prerequisite for doing what we do that it is strange to think about the extent to which 25 years ago there was so much ambivalence about that.
I can't remember whether it was on the one of these oral histories or not that we had a chance to go into the history of ISA and the blogging ban. Perhaps that's a topic for another time, but it is certainly interesting that we went through this phase of blogging is very suspect, being online is very suspect, to a point in which after the blogosphere was already pretty much dying, it became you have to have a blog and that will make things magically happen. If we have a blog, they will come into, I think, what's now the current era, which is we're back on Substack as a blogging platform of which some people are very successful. I don't know if we're getting a chance to get through this, but your evolution of where you wrote for and what you were writing and the way that related to your ideological beliefs, Jacob, is pretty interesting. So I don't know whether you want to talk about that a little bit or whether we want to hold off on that.
I figured we'd talk about it eventually.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and talk about it. I mean, that was actually one of my questions here as well, right? Which was phrased slightly differently, but why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so I left Volok for a variety of reasons, but some of them were substantive about the course of the Iraq War and the course of the mid to late Bush presidency and the direction I was going in and the direction that some of my co-bloggers were going in. I then stayed off blogging entirely for a couple of years, spent a little while on the funny Open University thing at the New Republic, which was a funny thing and didn't, I think, have a very big impact. But then eventually spent a good long stretch at Bleeding Heart Libertarians.
That's right. Right.
Which is a very different flavor of libertarian group blogging, and one that for a while was more satisfying in terms of who my co-bloggers were and the sense of having a shared mission. Shared missions fall apart. I'm genuinely kind of in awe that Lawyers, Guns, and Money, as well as Crooked Timber, has managed not to have explosive fights and schisms over as long as it has.
With one notably rare exception, Lab, but we'll try not to reopen that. But anyway, at least not involving most of our front pages, at least.
Right, but the thing is still there, which is more than we can say of Bleeding Heart Libertarians.
Yes,
but there was a while when being part of an avowedly pull libertarianism to the liberal left group academic project was something that made a lot of sense and felt like home and was conspicuously not the same sub-flavor of libertarianism as Volok was even back in 2003, to say nothing of by the mid-2010s.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's something that, that since we're talking about the University of Chicago, there's something in the trajectory, and I guess unfortunately, I think Judge Posner is in a very difficult circumstances right now. But of course, he had that interesting trajectory from sort of quirky libertarian, but right-leaning, moving more towards sort of just outright liberalism, sort of toward the end of his scholarly career, and that's you can kind of see that in the Voloc is that there's some libertarians who I think still call themselves some kind of libertarianism, but I don't know if you would be offended by the label liberal or not, or if you would. I would guess that you would not object to it. Whereas some
No, not at all.
Some parts of that trajectory is sort of divorced from any kind of have just sort of become more or less straightforward orthodox Republicans. Randy Barnett being one really obvious example. But that's it's sort of interesting to see that trajectory that there seems both Bush and then especially Trump have really compelled, either libertarians to say we're part of this broader liberal tradition, or just to sort of just become, MAGA and not, really with very little distinctive libertarian flavor. To the extent that when there are conflicts between libertarianism and MAGA, it's sort of interesting to see that play out.
Yeah, it's funny the extent to which bleeding heart libertarianism was primarily an Obama era blog and group. It arose out of actual intellectual developments, work that David Schmitz and Jerry Gauss, as the patrons and advisors of a bunch of my co-bloggers, had done, work that John Tomasi had done, work that I had been kind of doing on my own in a more poli-sci-ish way. Most of the rest of the BHL people were philosophers. It was a confluence of genuinely intellectual aspirations. It was not directly responsive to the fragmentation of libertarianism that happened twice, once under W. Bush and once under Trump. Right about the time that BHL started to decay, not when it fully exploded, but when it started to decay, just in terms of people's lack of engagement, lack of regular posting, as happens with a lot of group blogs. Partly, several of us picked up writing venues elsewhere in the early Trump era. I started writing much more heavily for the Niskanen Center at the time. And partly people ran out of steam for talking about just exactly the one shared enterprise that was bleeding heart libertarianism. But that was at the time that what had felt like some kind of shared intellectual ideological belonging among liberal-ish libertarians and conservative-ish libertarians just completely disappeared. I continue to regret that we didn't, at that point in 2016, 2017, 2018, have it in us to really recommit and re-engage to planting a flag and saying, right, it is now critically important that everyone who took seriously the right reasons for being libertarians fully commit to being liberals determined to help restore and protect liberalism in the face of rampant, rising, illiberal, populist, authoritarian autocracy.
Not all coming from the right either. Huh?
Not all coming, but
in the United States, certainly by far the most prominent.
Certainly by far the most powerful, most important. And part of what I wanted to do, and I've tried to be very consistent about this since 2016, 2017, is to avoid the chronic libertarian equivocation about that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Say, no, I am a liberal in coalition with liberals who are to my left, and I am not the hold my nose, stand above it all libertarian who says, well, I'm conservative economically and progressive socially, and look, you've never met anyone like me. I'm so different. No.
My views are so underrepresented.
Right. No, I'm a market flavored liberal, but I'm a liberal, damn it.
Right.
Yeah, I am told that formulation constitutes about 4/5 of all the guys available on Bumble and Twitter, or Bumble and Tinder. Sorry, but I'm socially liberal but economically conservative. Also, I caught this giant fish, and I'm not wearing a shirt.
So I mean, it's been a long time since I would even use that phrase.
Right.
I don't think of myself as being economically conservative. I think of myself as being a market liberal, and in an era when the conservative authoritarians are tearing down the global trading regime.
I was about to say, it's not hard to grok that in the current climate, right? Yeah,
Right.
that's one thing Trump has done is to clarify that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But anyway, anymore, people don't really, I think, in academia, conceive of there being a shared intellectual enterprise that is libertarianism. Matt Zwolinski has been writing about this a fair amount recently on his Substack, and he's right. It's, what it is that once upon a time we thought the Volok group and the BHL group, or the BHL group internally, all shared with each other, just no longer looks like it has held.
Can I drag back a little bit to, and this is going to sound like a technical question, but honestly, it's not. So the blogosphere, as classically conceived and as it still exists in certain places, was never just front pagers with network effects and so forth. It was always driven by attention and a relationship between the commenting public and who the front pagers are, right? And that's still really visible at LGM and some of the other blogs, but and I don't recollect, right? But in all of the different ventures that you had, especially starting with your own blog, but then moving to Volok and moving, like, what was your relationship with not the commenters, right? But the community of commenters in terms of sort of the intellectual viability of blogging, right? That at what point did you think of yourself, I'm writing to get linked by another, or I'm writing because it's interesting, versus I'm writing something because I want 100 people to comment on this thing that I just thought of and said? What kind of relationship did you have with commenting communities?
Almost none. There were never open comments. No, that's not true. I did eventually open comments on my personal blog, but on the assumption that that was attracting 2 or 3 remarks from my most faithful readers, who would sometimes correct me on some point of fact, or sometimes say, here's a related thing to read. I think when I started at Volok, there were not comments there. I think by the time I left, they were there, but I didn't read or engage with them. And at BHL, comments were generally open, and early on, when we were small enough, they were sometimes productive, but the comment section became difficult and toxic, and mostly I stopped reading it. That initial account I gave back in my very first blog post about why it was that I thought blogging had some potential as a valuable kind of engagement that was different from just holding forth was the network effects across blogs. It's the thought that you would write something that would attract a response and a criticism from a different blogger that would then show up in your trackbacks, such that when you got to the bottom of a post, you would be able to see, oh, here are the half dozen major reputable voices who have had something critical to say about this. And that was a device for keeping you honest. That appealed to me. And I liked writing multiple posts back and forth in dialogues between what I was doing and what people at Crooked Timber would say about what I was doing, and so on. So that was always my orientation, was the links and trackbacks that allowed for a sense of conversation across blogs, not the in-house.
That is interesting, right? And I don't know enough about the Substack ecosystem in terms of how it functions from a cultural point of view, but that is something that it feels to me. And I'm going to ask you another question. I'll preview it now, which is what killed the blogosphere. But that seems to be one of the things that was lost when the blogosphere passed from us, right? This idea that you would write. And I think probably generated by Twitter, but that you would write in anticipation that somebody and not even necessarily an ideologically friendly blog, right? I mean, we would we at LGM had all sorts of conflicts with all sorts of blogs, and you could readily anticipate that somebody was going to, hit us with the track back, hit us with a response, write an essay in response to the essay I just wrote. And that isn't even Twitter, right? I mean, Twitter is about dunking, right? There's other things that are about sort of short shots. But that's something that seems to me to have been fundamentally lost from where we were in the early blogosphere and to be essentially nowhere right now, that there's basically nothing like that. Again, sort of accepting that I don't fully understand the culture of Substack, but it doesn't seem to be all that present even at Substack.
Yeah, and Substack is trying with the sort of social media thing where you can like excerpt and kind of get stuff up. So I think it's at least trying to that, but there's just nothing comparable to, as Jacob says, that the primary engagement wasn't the comment section, it was with other blogs, and it was very much a blogosphere. And I think that's the difference, is that Substack does bring back blogging, and I think it shows value and interest in the format, but it's not the blogosphere. It's very different. It's just a different phenomenon. Whether better or worse, it's just not the same thing.
I think it depends on where you look on.
The fact that Substacks are so often transmitted by email, and that they get called newsletters.
Right.
They're set on broadcast, and that's there's some interesting and valuable work that people are doing, and they're writing good long form essays.
Right.
But it's a broadcast format, not in that distinctive way a conversational format and an exchange format that the early blogosphere was.
I don't think that's quite right. I think it depends on where you are on Substack. Now, I'm not an avid Substack reader. We've been in our efforts to maybe revive or maybe decide it's just not revivable. We've created a mirror site for Jack of Minerva at Substack, for example. But if you look at some of the more, I would say, not the top level Substackers with academic bona fides, but the sort of more upper mid tier, the people who are probably making a decent amount of side money on it, but aren't raking it in. There's a lot of substantive engagement across, but it's not necessarily centered on Substack, right? So it'll be a Substack that is substantively responding to a combination of emails and other Substack posts, and maybe something that appears in a WordPress blog. So I think I'm starting to see some evidence of that reconstituting there. Like if Sevogutnitsky's Substack does a lot of this, for example, and I'm wondering whether or not maybe that is a potential direction for it to go in. So I wouldn't be quite so quick to say that it is categorically distinct. I think that a lot of people are doing different things with the platform.
Essentially.
All right, that sounds hopeful.
Yeah. So when Scott asked the question earlier about sort of what the professional impact of your decision to start blogging was, that struck me. I think that there was this sort of, or you answered the question in terms of sort of almost its immediate or its sort of telescoped short-term impact. What about the long tails, right? And the story I like to tell here is that the idea for my first book came from a conversation with a blogger, so that even though the book did not come out until after the blogosphere was basically done, right, that this is still sort of part of the way that the blogosphere affected my professional and my intellectual development, right? So in those kinds of terms, both the experience of the very early up until 2005, but then at Volok and Bleeding Heart and so forth, what would you say has been the impact of this thing we call blogging on not just your sort of the immediate that happened then, but on your long-term intellectual development?
That's really interesting, but the fact that I'm having trouble thinking about it is probably telling. So what I remember most clearly, because it's most recent, is Bleeding Heart. But I was always an odd methodological and disciplinary fit at Bleeding Heart. I was the only poli-sci theorist there. I was almost the only poli-sci person there at all, except for Mike Munger, but Mike Munger is trained as an economist. Whereas the plurality of people there were trained philosophers. And there were conversations happening among them as philosophers that even when I thought, yeah, these are kind of basically my people normatively, they weren't my people for substantive conversation about how my own ideas were developing. There wasn't very much about institutions. There wasn't very much about the history of ideas. There wasn't very much about law. Uh, Whereas, of course, at Volok, there had been law, but there hadn't been the same seriousness about normative theory. My my intellectual developments over time come in part when I'm able to talk with other normative political theorists in political science, and that's been offline. What mattered more, I think, in the end was the opportunity to write for Niskanen and the sense of urgency that I had starting in 2016 about the political moment. But I didn't do that work on BHL. I did that work in long form essays that were not conversational and were not very responsive at Niskanen. And there I was trying to work out what it was that my theoretical orientation toward being a kind of institutionalist, kind of liberal of fear, kind of uh, constitutionalist about the preservation of basic institutions, uh, and the sort of market liberal libertarian who thought that market liberalism was situated within a liberal pluralistic rule of law framework that was now under threat, trying to articulate all of that on a pretty regular basis in long form, public facing political theory writings. My ideas evolved over the course of that. And there's a great deal that I can point to in my work now that arises out of that work. But it really wasn't work I did at BHL or at Volok.
Yeah, I was going to say, and so I don't know if you would even characterize this as a blog, but you wrote obviously sort of one of the pieces to really get a lot of attention and traction in the early Trump area, the weight of the words. Was that for Niskanen or?
That was Niskanen.
It was Niskanen, yeah. And I think really got sort of a lot of traction. And again, as part of the debate, I'll leave Corey Robin out of it because I think he's more or less conceded, but you still have the Sam Moynes, et cetera, who still want to insist that this is all overblown. This is all, and you were sort of one of the first people to sort of really take a stake on, this is not a triviality. We're not talking about mere rhetoric here, but both something that will be, have outgrowths in the law, but also, the rhetoric in and of itself, does have an impact.
It's transformative of our normative space.
Yeah, this is not like an Aaron Sorkin. The president gives a speech in Congress. The presidential rhetoric can matter in ways that are different. And obviously, I think it holds up really well. But that is sort of one of the last things I can think of that really had the kind of impact that like a big attention-getting blog would have gotten back in the day, even if whether it's of the blogosphere or not. I think it still had at least some of that resonance. So I don't know how you would situate that, but it did make me think of kind of one of the things that did remind me a little bit of the older blogosphere.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. And yeah, it seemed to have that kind of impact at the time, along with a couple of my other pieces there. The one on identity politics immediately after the 2016 election, even before the inauguration, and the one on lying and post-truth politics. I think those were probably three of my most read pieces there. And my ability to turn those around, my ability to think in a 2,000 word length, not a 10,000 word length, those are certainly outcomes of the time that I spent practicing shorter essayistic writing as a blogger. My connection to Will Wilkinson, who was my partner and editor during my most active time at Niskanen, that's something that came up out of the blogging time, and Will was a co-blogger at BHL. But they felt like I don't know, aspirational magazine articles or aspirational essays, not in that same way, back and forth pieces.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
I want to push you a little bit on this because your answer about how your work in the blog sphere was not so central to your intellectual evolution in academia is, I think, unusual.
I'd be happy to hear something that reminds me of some way that that's wrong.
Well, I'm not going to say it's wrong. I'm going to say that it's an unusual answer. I don't think
Okay.
it's the typical answer we get from people who are more or less in political science, government. Most of us would say that it was much more important, right? That we worked out a lot more ideas or even developed ideas through that format. And I'm wondering whether that's has something to do with where you were blogging, right? So if you think about, obviously, Volk, however you say it, I've heard it said about 4 times here, and yet I still can't quite remember it. And Bleeding Hearts, these are very kind of purposive, I would argue, more or less ideological projects, right? They're group blogs in which you're there for a reason to do certain things. And I think that is not generally been the case for people who answer in the affirmative. It's certainly not the case for me, right? That their blogging has either been personal or it's been more freewheeling, right? And I'm wondering whether or not this is true if we go back all the way to your initial blogging days as a solo blogger on Blogspot, whether in that era there might have been more connection between things you were doing academically and things you were writing about or working through, or whether that theory is just going to get shot down right now. So I'm curious about that.
At about the time that I was starting to blog, I was also starting to turn my research away from contemporary normative political theory toward the history of political thought. I even wonder whether part of what seemed interesting to me about picking up blogging was that it would continue to be a venue for having normative things to say about politics at a time when my research brain was heading back to the 18th and 19th centuries and before. But I didn't then do substantial, serious blogging about Montesquieu. That wouldn't have occurred to me that was something for which there was much appetite. Oh, you know what? Let me throw in an asterisk. I do think that my work, say 2005 to 2009-ish, about federalism and indigenous self-government was actually partly shaped by exchanges that were happening at Volok and between Volok and other places about constitutional developments and federalism in the United States. That ended up as being a section of my more history of political thought book, Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom. And so it doesn't stick out in my mind as being one of the big directions I took, but it was a significant cluster of articles and something that I spent several years really thinking about. But that's still not answering your original question about whether it was different when I was solo blogging or whether it was the mission character of those 2 big group blogs that dampened its intellectual effect. Open University at New Republic, I had a sense of it really just failing precisely by being missionless. I never understood what the criteria of selection were, why it was that we 7 or 8 or 9 or so people were all there, what we were supposed to have in common. We never built up any conversation among ourselves as what you guys call the front pagers. And it was just a list. And by virtue of being just a list without a shared subject or shared ideological orientation or shared methodological orientation, it never gelled in any meaningful way. So I think I got less out of that than I did out of the 2 group blogs, even though the other group blogs were more mission statement-ish.
Well, it doesn't support my hypothesis, but it does answer the question, right?
Okay.
But I am actually glad you mentioned that, because I did find the idea of this larger disconnect a little bit perplexing, because I think I only knew about your federalism work and some ideas about what you were doing in the federalism work before the book actually came out through your blogging activity. Right. And maybe that was because of the legal American constitutional law aspect of it. I don't know. But
and because it was an area where my developing expertise about centralization and decentralization actually touched on contemporary questions. So it was a chance for my brain to get out of Montesquieu and Tocqueville and into something that had some broader interest.
Yeah, we'll have to book you for the Alberta secessionism podcast. We'll hold that for October.
Scott, I know you have to. You have a time limit here. Is there anything you want to ask before you have to roll?
Yeah, so I guess one last question, and I'm really interested in what happened at Open University, because that's something I know Rob and I went through, sort of working for the American Prospect, which, for a long time, Tapped was really one of the group blogs that was successful. And I don't know if it had a mission statement, but at least it had a coherent, identity. People talked among themselves. They were engaged. But it was one of those things where, a new editor would take over and they say, "Oh, let's give it a new name," and then they just would get bored with it after 3 weeks. That it really seemed like there was an era where sort of editors, we're supposed to do a blog, but there's no follow up behind it. It sounded like there was no attempt to sort of, who are we picking here? How will they speak to each other, and then sort of guide that. There's pretty much just, we have a blog. Here's some people who are bloggers. Let's throw it out there and hope it gets,
right.
And I think that, and I don't know if there's any contingency, any choices that could have been made differently. If it's just a reality of the fact that small political magazines just go through a lot of editors and nobody has any, commitment to the previous regime or whatever. But that seemed like that was a pretty, one of the things that led to the demise of the blogosphere was the sort of inattention. It was sort of a fad that was quickly dropped by the magazines, where I think that, having a blogging presence could have actually been really useful and helped them maintain a digital audience at the time when print circulation was starting its inevitable decline.
I don't remember a sense that Open University suffered from editorial turnover. The New Republic was subsequently going to go through an era of really rapid and really catastrophic and really bizarre and kinds of editorial turnover, such that the idea that there was any continuity at the magazine disappeared pretty rapidly in the era of move fast and break things.
Yes. Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg's yacht is currently, we drove past it on the way to work today.
But I don't think that we had a big editorial turnover during our time there. I think that just it never fully cohered even at launch.
Okay.
I think there were some of us who were experienced bloggers, but much more junior scholars, some people who were in the New Republic stable of very senior, famous academic writers who were given, here's a username and a password, and now you can post really rapidly when you feel like it, but they had other paying venues for much of their writing, and so I'm not sure that some of them ever really found it a very interesting opportunity to take advantage of. And as I said, we were a thoroughly eclectic group. Not even sure I remember which editor put it together to go back and ask what was the idea behind who we were.
The best of those was, and I don't even remember the name of it, right? And I mean best here, not in terms of its sort of specific quality, but the sort of most conversational was, I think, the National Reviews.
The corner. The corner still exists.
Yeah. Does it still exist? Is it still there in some fashion?
Yes. Yes, it is.
When Derbyshire would rant,
yes,
and all the other ones, it was great.
It was a really lively, engaging blog for a long time before National Review itself schismed over Trump. If you look at it now, it is not very interesting, but for a long time it was quite lively.
Yeah, I was just reading about they had a piece about how, need to say like James Paxton may be bad, but that's nothing compared to like, Delorgo being a fake Christian. Like, oh, Jesus Christ.
Right.
Like, oh God. So anyway, on that
and,
note,
and
oh, go ahead.
I mean, part of it is there used to be people at National Review who would call each other out on things and say, oh, come on. It's one thing to say that to the rubes, but here in-house, and there was a pretense of it being here in-house, we're supposed to tell the truth to each other, right? And we're not supposed to just sloganeer.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
And
Scott,
there are authors we can attach to each of those moods at the National Review Corner.
No, and Scott, I remember you used to talk about this one all the time, right? Was it when Kalo? It was in the immediate wake of the woman whose brain liquefied, and John Derbyshire just like relentlessly, no mercy, just destroyed everyone around him at the corner, just mocked them brutally for
Yes.
Yeah, and the Derb obviously has many of his own issues. But
yes,
that's right.
To put it mildly, but yes, he was
a racist pedophile.
Yes.
But boy, oh boy, was he an interesting presence there, a racist and
he was certainly right about the things he was right about too.
And pathologically homophobic. Buggery, I used to call him. But he had no patience for other people's religious pieties.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the podcast.
Good to talk with you, Scott.
So this topic, I think, gets us into some interesting terrain that I'd like to make sure we have at least some brief discussion of, some of which you've touched on before, but they have to do with, in some degree, the old Wild West days of the blogosphere, which is, important beefs in your intellectual development. And also important effects of being engaged in a semi-prominent online fashion to more prominent online fashion on your kind of, not so much your intellectual development, but your academic, political networks, right? So it's affected kind of your informational universe, that sort of thing in a way that might be not directly or obviously tied to what you're working on at any given moment. So I'm interested in those two questions: beefs and sort of a network of internet-based, blogosphere-based, intellectual people were in the sort of salon as far as you're concerned, even if you were not engaging with them as directly, right?
I'm going to have to think about whether I feel like saying anything about beefs.
We've had great discussions about beefs in general, with a lot of people being like, oh, yeah, we had these beefs. They were kind of silly. Right. Or, they sort of, in a way, they kind of became, we had a lot of people, of course, were captured by their own performatives, but in many ways they were also kind of performative. And retrospectively, it's easy to see that. I mean, Rob, I think you talked to some people like that. On the other hand, we've had people who have refused to go on, in part, even with guarantees that we're going to be nice. So, I don't know.
Right, well, this is about reigniting the momentum. But one of the proudest moments of this extremely limited series was that we had Mickey Kaus on here, right? And it was wonderful. He was wonderful.
Oh yeah,
right. He was so cheerful and engaging and just really everything else. And if you go back and look at what I wrote about him in 2005, right, much of it is unprintable in polite company, right? And so. So I was very happy that we managed to do that. But yeah, we've also had situations where the beef has not subsided.
Let's rephrase that as frenemies. How about? People who got your kind of juices flowing, that maybe you had disagreements with, that might have been important to you intellectually, even if they didn't show up in your work, like or at least were important to you in terms of your blogging, right? Like you talk about being driven by debates. So who were those interlocutors, and how did they affect your growth?
Let's see. The names that come to mind here are Russell Arbin Fox, John Holbo, Chris Bertram, Henry Farrell, all of whom, except Russell, are Crooked Timber folks. Those are people with whom there are lots of things that I don't have in common, but who I always really liked having blog conversations with. And I thought that my thought was improving over the course of going back and forth with them about things, and who at different times opened my eyes to the reasonableness of positions that I wasn't inclined to be sympathetic toward. Yeah, that's not the same as beefs. Those were all people I felt like were developing online friendships, but they were online friendships that were marked by genuine disagreement and back and forth in some good, productive ways.
Well, that combines both aspects of the question. So that's great. And that was primarily in terms of people who are coming from the left or the more communitarian tradition, it sounds like, right?
Yeah, that's right. When we were all starting to blog, I think the sense that Russell was clearly to my left wouldn't have been quite so sharp. I think that the way in which Russell's communitarianism now is a left communitarianism, I think that wasn't true for him or wasn't clear to him at the time. And I remember originally engaging with him as someone who was more of a religious localist and less of a social democratic kind of communitarian. Then there are people who were closer to where I was and where just working the ideas out together was really interesting and productive. That cluster eventually, let's say, Julian Sanchez, Will Wilkinson, the late Steve Horwitz, Sarah Squire. Some of these were conversations that ended up happening on Facebook more than on the blogs, and we were going to get back to the question, what killed the blogosphere? And the obvious answer is social media. But for some of the people I only got to know intellectually online, some often didn't meet in person for many years, the conversations that happened on the blogs and the conversations that happened in long comment threads on Facebook all kind of run together in my memory. But Julian and Will were significant bloggers who helped give voice to the kind of liberal-ish libertarianism that I was working my way toward, as well as Radley Balco. But while I admire Bradley tremendously and read him obsessively, he wasn't the same kind of conversation partner. He was out there working in his investigative beat and really doing his writing. So those are, I think, the two clusters that come to mind for people with whom talking just really mattered for me over the decades.
Your answer, I think, gets at something to me that personally matters about the old blogosphere, which was the way in which there were a lot of relationships that weren't quite parasocial because they were social in an online sense. Mm-hmm. That meant that there were a lot of people I read, including you, Jacob, whose ideas were just important to me, right? Who kind of were almost citation-like in the sense that these were names that I could think about, and I could think about what they were arguing, and I think that's something that I really did want to get a sense of, and I think that's part of the old blogosphere that kind of got lost, and I think that's less a function of social media per se than the dunking culture, right? Of the Twitter now kind of blue sky style engagement. And I did think that you did touch on something that I thought was interesting that I hadn't thought as much about, but which is there was a period of time, I think, in which Facebook was not so much competitive, but synergistic. Yes. With that environment. Because I think about sort of how a lot of the academic and academic adjacent friends community where there was substantive discussion that I was at least, an insect or a fly on the wall for on Facebook. I was friends with all those people because we sort of knew each other's names from the blogosphere.
Right.
Right. And so it was there was a more of a back and forth there rather than a completely hived off separate social realities aspect to it that I think persisted for a while before, everything kind of went away. And I think that's a segue then to what Rob is probably going to ask about. It was one of the things.
Yeah. So First, I completely agree with that. Um, you know, I feel like I'm one of the few people who's still on Facebook in any sort of reasonable amount of time, and I don't know why. Right? I mean, I have absolutely no idea why. Other than sitting around waiting for my birthday when it makes me feel happy, or looking through the memories, right? The Facebook memories, but the
Right.
memories just indicate how much I used Facebook more in the past than I do it now. That I could see younger pictures of my children when they were still cute, but. Um, so, two questions that are related. First, how much of your archives are still out there and present? How much of those things can you still find out on the internet of stuff you wrote all the way back to 2002? And I have no idea about Open University or Bleeding Heart, sort of where they are, if they're still available for people to find and read. And then, the second question, which we all indicated earlier, previewed earlier, where would you say is the point where the blogosphere died, right? Is it Twitter? Is it the death of Google Reader? Is it the professionalization, which you were part of, and we were part of the blogosphere, right? Where did things start falling apart, and when was the corpse finally buried?
All right. I think that I know the answer to the first, which is that my solo blog, which I've also intermittently over the years gotten a funny moment of resurrecting for a month or two at a time. My solo blog, as far as I know, still exists with its archives fully intact. I believe that the old Volok archives, since Volok has since then moved once to the Washington Post and once to Reason, I believe that they are not easily findable and searchable. Open University, there's no record of at all. It's probably on the Wayback Machine, but I'm quite sure that there is not a copy of it at tnr.com anywhere to be found. Neither, I think, are Dan Dresner's and my old TNR columns still findable on the TNR website.
So much I showed the girls Blade Runner for the first time last Friday, and so much of the internet is just, endless, lost like tears in rain moments. Right? It's just
well, and if you share my habit of looking at Facebook memories, then you'll see the funny Back to the Future photograph development of those comment threads as other people leave Facebook and big holes appear in the comment threads. Right. Where someone must have said something like this, but you can no longer find out who it was. Anyway, Bleeding Heart Libertarians, it is locked, but it still exists. The archives are all still there. There was some internal contention about the degree to which it was going to be locked down and frozen in amber, but it is locked down and frozen in amber. And all the Niskanen pieces are still there. I actually had reason to check a couple of those just recently. When did it die? Because I had this funny do something for a while, drift off, do something for a while, quit because it was no longer really my kind of group. I think it's harder for me to say because I think that it was dying during the long stretch after I left Volok in 2005 and before Bleeding Heart launched, which I want to say was 2012. I think that by the time Bleeding Heart launched, the patient was ailing. And I didn't really realize that or notice that because I hadn't been actively doing it and all the time in between. I'd been an active reader using Google Reader, as you say. Don't understand why the disappearance of Google Reader was so catastrophic, given that Feedly does just the same thing. And I don't understand how people navigate the internet without having an RSS feed. But boy, do people not even know what an RSS feed is. It's still basically my homepage is my RSS
it's still so
reader.
important to me. There are RSS, and I also do Feedly. Yeah, I mean, as Google Reader matured, it was a lot of fun to see what other people were sharing, right? And Feedly doesn't have the same kind of functionality with that. But when you had a good Google Reader community of friends, right, you got some really interesting stuff. And so, but yeah, no, I add RSS feeds even now, right,
Yeah,
when I can find
me
them.
too.
So,
Me too. But I think that by the time I was back at blogging in 2012 or so, the patient was ailing. Does that seem true to the people who were doing it continuously?
I mean, for us, because we are, Laurie Spence-Bunny is an outlier, right? And so, for us, I think, and Dan and I have talked about this at some length, right? At some point, we at LGM stopped, and this is one of the reasons why your answer about the comments was interesting, right? At some point, we stopped caring about trackbacks because they just stopped existing anymore,
Right.
right? Nobody
Right.
ever linked to anything. And we integrated social media into what we did at LGM, and that is still important. I think that like Scott's handle on X and maybe even on Blue Sky has
Is
LGM in it.
Lemieux LGM? Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so it was part of our identity, but at some point, I think we just came to the recognition the reason we're blogging is for the commenters. It's for the commenting community which we generated.
Right.
And that they fundamentally are the audience we're talking to. They're the audience that talks back to us. And I mean, that just sort of by its nature is not something that can capture an entire industry, right? I mean, you can only have a few nodes that are going to work that way, where you have 4 or 5 people blogging and then hundreds of people commenting on what they're commenting on, right? And we're just sort of fortunate enough that we were one of the sites that survived in that sense. And Duncan Black's Eschaton is another one of those, and there are a few others. But I think. And I think it certainly happened during the period you're talking about, that the transition by 2012 was almost complete, right? In that there was no longer for us this blogosphere that you could meaningfully talk about, where other bloggers read your stuff and you saw what they were reading about or what they were saying about what you were saying about. So that feels entirely correct to me. And Google Reader, the end of Google Reader is just kind of the wake for how that all happened.
Right. Have you talked with anyone from, or has it come up on any of the previous conversations, the left to right brief-lived academic blog?
Oh my God.
I didn't even remember it until you just mentioned it.
Remember that.
Elizabeth Anderson was the biggest name and is a even bigger name since then. Don Herzog, I think Liz and Don Herzog were the two initial moving forces, but it was an interesting attempt for a moment in that middle time. What I'm thinking of as the middle time, I think it came out about 2008 or so, to get very heavy duty academics who shared what they took to be a kind of intellectual mission in an era of then emerging polarization, but that we now look back on and say, you didn't know from polarization yet. And some of Liz Anderson's subsequent work, she started formulating in essays that she was posting there. I'm sure that she was already doing it in her head. I'm sure it wasn't blogging itself that was doing it. But it was a big, interesting experiment, and the fact that it quickly lost steam at the time felt to me kind of strange, and in retrospect telling, that this bunch of people who genuinely had a sense of purpose and who are talented, prolific writers just couldn't keep it going very long.
Well, the ideological part of this is interesting, right? Because I feel like almost by the 2004 election, that prior to the 2004 election, there was robust conversation between commenters and bloggers that went back and forth between what we could characterize as left Blogistan and right Blogistan. That sort of really began to deteriorate almost immediately in the wake of the 2004 election. And it was never hermetically sealed, right? But you didn't have the same sort of cross ideological blog conflicts that you had earlier, which is what made left to right so strange to me, right? Because it seemed like almost an artifact of a different age, even when it started. No.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that the old blogosphere in the one that you're describing, the really, really, I think, intense cross-ideological discussions, those were probably dying by the time that I started up the Duck Minerva, which was about 2006. So I think we were already past that first wave, right? That was done. But I do think that the odd thing for us as academics was that the importance of blogging in academia was still increasing. I think up until the mid 2000s, I would say even after 2012. And that reflects, I think, in part the end of the old blogosphere and a changing and shifting purpose of blogging. But I don't think that, I do think that I think it's important to think about different phases of the blogosphere increasingly is the way I'm thinking about it, until we talk about its actual death, which clearly is, by the later 20 teens, it's pretty much gone, right? Or limping along. And now what's interesting is that we have sort of the reproduction of something like a mashup of some of those eras now happening on these other platforms. And their big advantage of these other platforms is the social media algorithms, the ease of going to one place and being able to exchange links or see what anyone else is doing, which I think suggests that part of the big reason why the blogosphere worked the way that you guys in particular, because you were active in its peak period, was a function of its size, that it just wasn't very big.
That's right. It was reasonably possible to read everything that the blogs you cared about were producing in a given day or a week without it feeling like that's all that you were doing.
Plus, the pioneers all kind of got to know each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a sense of some degree of community and to some degree of kind of the kind of behavioral norms that go along with I know this person and think I kind of like them, even though I disagree with them.
Right. And in lots of the group blogs, there ended up being one person who was more prickly and more elbows out, and who nobody from the other ideologically different group blogs liked that way. But mostly there were substantial numbers of people who did like to talk with each other. All of which reminds me, there's one important parasocial relationship and influence who I didn't mention because he didn't come into either of the groups I was thinking about, and that was Scott Eric Kaufman.
Oh, yeah.
I still think about Scott when I'm watching TV and watching movies. He transformed the way that I look at visual representations and think about visual rhetoric. And I hardly remember Scott ever writing anything about politics. And when we talked back and forth, we were never particularly talking about anything in my academic wheelhouse. We were talking to some extent about stuff in his academic wheelhouse. But I found reading his work tremendously transformative. I'm really glad that I got to meet him once. Mm-hmm. But by the time I met him, it already felt like this is a meaningful relationship in my brain space.
Right. I still assign his stuff on Watchmen when I teach Watchmen in classes. So, yeah, no, that's a kind of a bittersweet example.
And he's really the person we needed for the Trump era too. I can only imagine.
Oh yes,
I can only imagine really everything he would have wrote. But then hopefully we'll form a collection at some point. So we've been for about 80 minutes here. I think we're sort of reaching the end. Jacob, I want to thank you for joining us, Dan, and also Scott, who moved along a few minutes ago. But this has been absolutely delightful.
It's been great. Good to talk with you.
All right. Well, then, Lawyers, Guns, and Money listeners, we will be back with another podcast soon, whether it be history of the blogosphere or something else, maybe national security. Who knows? We're in a war that may end someday, right? Or maybe it ends every day, right? According to the president, it's very hard to say. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you again for listening to the Lawyers, Guns, and Money podcast. We would like to thank Elizabeth Nelson of the Paranoid Style for supplying as our intro and outro music I'd Bet My Lands and Titles, a track on the album For Executive Meeting. If you would like to support the Lawyers, Guns, and Money podcast or any other aspect of the Lawyers, Guns, and Money project, please visit us at www.patreon.com/lawyersgunsandmoney or donate at the PayPal link on the website. Thank you.